Historians, Miss Melton here to talk to you about Jim Crow laws. First, we're going to look at the Pearson text. Other laws kept African Americans from voting. Some states charged a poll tax or payment to vote. Many African Americans couldn't afford the poll tax. Some states required African Americans to take a reading test before they could vote. Under slavery, many had not been allowed to learn to read or write, and so they failed the test. A grandfather clause was added to some state constitutions. It said that men could vote only if their father or grandfather had voted before 1867. This grandfather clause kept most African Americans from voting because they had not gained the right to vote until 1870. It would be a long time before most African Americans enjoyed the civil rights that they should have as citizens. Now let's look at the Scott Forsman text. While Southern Democrats gained their power in state governments, almost immediately new laws were passed that again restricted the rights of African Americans. Whites tried to prevent blacks from voting in several ways. They set up voting booths far from African American communities or changed the location of the booths without informing blacks. Some states required a poll tax or payment in order to vote. Many African Americans could not afford the poll tax. In some places, blacks were forced to take a reading test before voting. Under slavery, many people had not been allowed to learn to read and write, and so they failed the test. A grandfather clause was added to some state constitutions. It said that men could only vote if their father or grandfather had voted before 1867. The grandfather clause kept most African Americans from voting because they had not gained the right to vote until 1870. Jim Crow laws were also passed. These laws enforced segregation or separation of blacks and whites. Under Jim Crow laws, blacks could not sit with whites on trains or stay in certain hotels. They also could not eat in certain restaurants or attend certain theaters, schools, or parks. And this is a picture of a minstrel from like a puppet show um, and we'll talk about that more on the next page, of a character called Jim Crow. After the Civil War, white Southerners moved quickly to eliminate black people's newfound freedom. They wanted to return blacks, in effect, into the pre war status as slaves. In order to do this legally, they passed new laws that appeared on the surface to be neutral and fair to all races. In actuality, however, these laws were actually designed specifically to repress black people. At first, these laws were called black codes because of their deceptive nature. They eventually came to be known as the laws of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the name of a character in a minstrel show. Minstrel shows were popular during that time and they featured white actors in blackface or black makeup. Because of this, the name Jim Crow represented the fact that black codes were based on racial disguise. South Carolina began to establish black codes immediately. The Constitution of 1865, passed only a few months after the Civil War ended, failed to grant African Americans the right to vote. It also retained racial qualifications for the legislature. Consequently, black people had no power to combat the unfair laws. Some of the black codes that were passed around at this time stated, "No person shall migrate into and reside in this state unless within 20 days after his arrival within the same, he shall enter into a bond with two freeholders as sureties." So two people have to vouch for you. Servants shall not be absent from the premises without the permission of the master. Servants must assist their masters in defense of his own person, family, premises, or property. No person of color could become an artisan, mechanic, or shopkeeper unless he obtained a license from the judge of the district court, a license that could cost $100 or more. So these were specifically South Carolina's Jim Crow laws. Other states passed other Jim Crow laws. This is an example of segregation under Jim Crow law where they had different water fountains. This is from Mr. Nussbaum's website. Jim Crow laws were laws established to promote racial segregation, especially after the federal government stopped enforcing the promotion of civil rights in the South in 1877 after Reconstruction. Circumventing the new amendments. After the Civil War, the federal government passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875. These amendments and acts were specifically designed to protect the civil rights of black people. After 1877, when the government stopped enforcing civil rights, the Southern white people in power, known as Redeemers, immediately sought to take away the civil rights of Black people that had been granted by twisting the language of the new laws to subjugate Black people. Such laws mandated racial discrimination and became known as Jim Crow laws, named after a racist cartoon strip of a poor, uneducated Black man. Jim Crow laws came in many forms. For example, one such laws required Black people to qualify to vote by paying poll taxes or by reciting the entire Declaration of Independence or Constitution from memory. In 1883, the federal government ruled that it did not have the power to prohibit private segregation and maintain that separate facilities, including schools, restaurants, drinking fountains, etc., were constitutional, provided that facilities were equal in the famous Plessy versus Ferguson 163 U.S. 537, 1896 case. Of course, equal facilities were never really equal at all. Other laws required Black people to sit in the back of public buses, prohibited interracial marriage, and limited employment opportunities for Black people. So again, different states had different laws in their constitution to limit the freedom of African Americans in their state. Legal discrimination for the next 100 years. Although these laws were eventually deemed unconstitutional, most not until the 1950s and 1960s, severe racism and discrimination toward Black people continued to dominate the culture of some parts of the South for 70 or 80 years. So here are some important things to know about Jim Crow laws that you should have taken away from the reading. Jim Crow laws were passed in Southern state governments. Jim Crow laws were different for the different states. Jim Crow laws made restrictions on voting, including using ballot taxes, reading tests, and the grandfather clause. Jim Crow laws also enforced segregation and put restrictions on having certain jobs, and there were lots of other Jim Crow laws for different states, but those were just some. So those were some important facts about the Jim Crow laws.